Hello, and welcome. It is time to let the day and all of its concerns simply fade away. Find your most comfortable position and gently close your eyes. Let's begin with a single, slow breath. Breathe in deeply. And as you breathe out, feel the tension begin to leave your body. There is nothing else you need to do tonight. Nothing to focus on, and nothing to remember. The story I am about to tell is just a quiet murmur in the background, a calm and steady presence. Tonight, we will travel back to the Roman Republic to hear the simple story of a farmer and the land he worked. So just relax and allow the sound of my voice to accompany you as you drift towards a deep and peaceful sleep. Our story begins in the year 253 BCE, during the quiet middle years of the Roman Republic. It is a time of burgeoning strength for Rome, city-state solidifying its control over the Italian peninsula, its gaze just beginning to turn across the sea towards the mighty empire of Carthage. But these grand strategies, these tales of legions and naval fleets, are a distant murmur, a story for merchants and magistrates in the bustling forum. Here in the sun-drenched hills of Latium, some 20 miles from the city's noise, the world is much smaller, defined by the turning of the seasons and the toil of the earth. This smaller world is the home of Lucius Vibius Caecina. He is a man of 40 years, his face and hands weathered by a lifetime of sun and soil. His farm is not a grand estate, no sprawling latifundium worked by legions of slaves. It is a modest inheritance, a handful of ugera of land that his father and grandfather worked before him. It is just enough. A small, whitewashed stone house, its roof tiled with terracotta that glows a warm orange in the late afternoon light, sits nestled amongst a grove of olive trees whose leaves shimmer a dusty silver in the breeze. Lucius's days are etched in routine, a rhythm as old and predictable as the sun's path across the sky. He rises before the first light bleeds over the horizon, the cool morning air still smelling of damp earth and wild rosemary. His first task is always to check on the animals, the single, aging ox that is the cornerstone of his livelihood, a few goats for milk and cheese, and a small flock of chickens that scratch and peck in the yard. He speaks to them in low, comforting tones, his voice a familiar rumble in the pre-dawn quiet. His life is a constant conversation with the land. He knows every contour of his fields, the way the water pools near the old oak after a rain, the patch of ground where the wheat grows thickest, the stubborn, rocky soil near the northern fence that requires twice the effort for half the yield. His primary field is for grain, the spelt and wheat that will become the porridge and coarse bread that sustains his family. On the gentle slope facing south, rows of grapevines twist their gnarled arms around wooden stakes, their leaves unfurling in the spring and growing heavy with dusty purple fruit by late summer. And then there are the olive trees, the oldest things on the farm, their trunks thick and wrinkled like an old man's skin. They are his pride, a legacy that provides the oil for their lamps, for their cooking, and for trade. The work is hard, a relentless cycle of plowing, sowing, weeding, and reaping. In the heavy heat of midday, the sun beats down with a physical weight, and sweat stings Lucius's eyes. His back aches, his muscles burn, a familiar fire that has been his companion since boyhood. Yet there is a deep and abiding satisfaction in it. This land is his. The food on his table is the fruit of his own labor. He is beholden to no man, a free citizen of Rome, a plebeian to be sure, but one who can stand on his own soil and call it home. His world is completed by his family. His wife Cassia is a quiet, capable woman whose hands are as calloused as his own.
House.
She manages the house, grinds the grain, makes the cheese, and tends the vegetable garden where beans, onions, and cabbages grow. Her presence is a steady, calming anchor in Lucius's life. They have 2 children. Their son Marcus, at 12, is already learning the ways of the farm, his young shoulders straining to guide the plow under his father's watchful eye. He is a serious boy, keenly aware of the responsibility that will one day be his. Their daughter Livia is 8, a bright spark of energy who helps her mother, and whose laughter often echoes through the olive grove as she chases chickens or weaves crowns of wildflowers. Evenings are the time of rest. After the tools are cleaned and put away and the animals are secured for the night, the family gathers around a simple wooden table inside the small house. The single room is lit by the flickering flame of an olive oil lamp, which casts long dancing shadows on the stone walls. The meal is simple: a thick porridge of spelt, a wedge of hard goat cheese, a handful of olives, and perhaps an onion, washed down with water, or on occasion a little sour wine mixed with water. The conversation is of the day's work, of a loose stone in the wall that needs mending, of the first signs of ripening on the grapevines. These are the good days. These are the days of stability, where life, though hard, is predictable and secure. Lucius feels the quiet pride of a man providing for his own. He owes nothing. He asks for nothing. When the traveling merchants pass on the dusty road below his farm, bringing news of Rome, of new temples being built, of political squabbles between powerful families, of the endless war with Carthage, Lucius listens with mild interest, but it feels like a story from another world. His world is here, in the feel of the dark earth crumbling in his hands, and the sound of his son's labored breathing as he learns to scythe. Oh. In the taste of the first olive pressed from the harvest, but this year something is different. The summer arrived early, with a fierce, unrelenting heat. The spring rains, usually so reliable, had been brief and half-hearted, barely enough to dampen the surface of the soil. Now, as summer deepens, the sun is a merciless tyrant in a sky that remains a vast, empty expanse of pale, washed-out blue. Day after day, Lucius scans the horizon, searching for the faintest hint of a cloud, a promise of relief, but none comes. The earth in his main field has grown hard, cracking into a mosaic of dry fissures. The wheat stalks are stunted, their heads thin and underdeveloped. The grapevines, usually so vibrant, have begun to wilt, their leaves turning a sickly yellow at the edges. The well, which has never run dry in his lifetime, is alarmingly low, the water he draws each morning murkier than the last. A subtle tension, a quiet hum of anxiety, begins to settle over the farm. The usual chorus of insects seems to have faded, replaced by a tense, shimmering silence in the midday heat. Lucius tries to hide his worry from Cassia, but he sees it reflected in her eyes when she looks at the wilting vegetable garden. They speak of it in hushed tones after the children are asleep, their words filled with a hope that feels increasingly fragile. All they need is one good, soaking rain, one storm to save the harvest. Yet the empty, silent sky offers no reply. The season is turning, and with it the fortunes of Lucius Vibius Caecina are about to turn as well. The rain never came. The summer bled into a long, arid autumn, the sky remaining a sheet of brilliant, unforgiving blue. The heat did not break, but merely softened, leaving the land gasping. For Lucius, Each dawn was a renewed vigil, and each dusk a quiet defeat. The rituals of the harvest, usually a time of communal effort and tired satisfaction, became a somber, solitary affair. The wheat was the first great loss. When he and Marcus finally took their sides to the field, the stalks were brittle and short, rattling with a dry, empty sound. The heads of grain were pitifully small, many of them containing nothing but chaff. They worked for days under the hazy sun, the dust rising in choking clouds around them. And when the entire yield was threshed and winnowed, it amounted to less than a third of what they needed to survive the winter. The grape harvest was no better. The vines, starved of water, had produced small, hard clusters of fruit. The grapes were intensely sweet but lacked the juice and body needed for good wine. The pressing yielded a meager amount of a thick, syrupy liquid that would barely suffice for their own table, leaving nothing to trade or sell at the local market. But the deepest cut to Lucius's pride was the olive harvest. These ancient, resilient trees had always been his assurance against hardship. This year, however, their branches were sparse. Many of the olives had withered and dropped prematurely, littering the ground like hard black pebbles. The ones that remained were small and yielded a thin, bitter oil. As autumn settled in, a profound quiet fell over the farmstead. It was the quiet of scarcity. The storeroom, usually overflowing with sacks of grain, large clay amphorae of wine and oil, and strings of onions and garlic, looked stark and empty. Cassia managed their dwindling supplies with a silent, careful precision. Meals became even simpler, portions smaller. The coarse bread she baked was mixed with bean flour to make the wheat last longer. The children, sensitive to the unspoken anxiety that now filled their home, ate without complaint, their usual boisterous energy subdued. There was no surplus, no comfort, nothing to spare. The small hoard of coins Lucius kept hidden in a clay pot beneath a floorstone savings from two. Good harvests remained untouched, a final defense against utter catastrophe. Winter arrived not with gentle snows, but with a cold, dry wind that swept across the barren fields, carrying the scent of dust. The earth was as hard as iron, locked in a rainless frost. It was during this bleak season that the second blow fell, a misfortune born from the first. Their ox, old and worn, had been weakened by the poor fodder of the autumn. The hay they had managed to gather was thin and lacking in nourishment, and the animal grew gaunt, its ribs showing starkly beneath its hide. Lucius did what he could, feeding it precious handfuls from their own meager grain supply, a sacrifice that pained him with every offering. He spent hours with the beast in its small, cold stall, rubbing its flanks and speaking to it in the same low, comforting tones he had used for years. The ox was more than just livestock. It was the engine of the farm, the living machinery Lucius could never afford to replace. Without it, he could not plow. Without plowing, there could be no spring sowing. The thought was a cold knot of dread in his stomach. One morning, in the heart of winter, Lucius entered the stall to find the ox lying on its side. Its breathing shallow and labored, did not have the strength to stand. He knelt beside it, the cold of the packed earth seeping through his tunic, and laid a hand on its bony head. The animal let out a soft, final sigh, a small cloud of steam in the frigid air, and then was still. Lucius remained there for a long time, kneeling in the silent darkness, his hand resting on the cooling hide of his dead servant. A wave of utter powerlessness washed over him, more profound than anything he had felt during the drought. The forces of nature had taken his harvest. Now they had taken his future. He felt not just poor, but broken. The land, his partner for so many years, suddenly felt like an adversary, a silent, unpitying force that had condemned him. That evening, the conversation with Cassia was heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. They sat at the table, the lamp casting a small pool of light in the dark room, the children asleep on their straw pallets. Lucius finally explained the grim arithmetic of their situation. The harvest would not last through the spring. They had no animal to plow the fields, and the spring sowing was only a few months away. He revealed the extent of their savings, a small collection of silver denarii and bronze asses, carefully counted and recounted. It was enough to feed them for a few more months, or it was enough to buy a young half-trained ox, but it was not enough for both. They were caught in a trap. To survive the winter, they had to consume the very means of their survival for the next year. Cassia listened, her face pale in the flickering light. She was a practical woman, not given to despair, but Lucius could see the tremor in her hands. They explored every possibility, their voices low and strained. Could they lease an ox?
Oh.
No one would lend an animal when their own fodder was scarce. Could Lucius find work as a laborer on a larger estate? Perhaps, but the wages would be a pittance. Barely enough to buy a sack of grain, and it would mean leaving his own fields untended. Could they sell a small piece of their land? The thought was a physical pain to Lucius, a violation of his heritage, and who would buy it in such a desperate time? The night wore on, the oil in the lamp burning low. Every path they considered led to a dead end, a wall of impossibility. Slowly, reluctantly, a single, terrible option began to surface. An idea so shameful that Lucius had never allowed himself to even consider it before. It was the path of last resort for a free Roman farmer, a step towards a kind of servitude he had always looked down upon. He could borrow money. The word itself felt foreign and bitter in his mouth. To be in debt was to be dependent, to be at the mercy of another man. It was an admission of failure, a stain on his family's name. But as the last of the lamplight guttered and died, plunging the room into darkness, Lucius knew, with a cold certainty, that there was no other choice. The drought had cracked the foundation of his life, but the death of his ox had brought the whole structure crashing down. To rebuild, he would need help, and in the world of Rome, help for a man like him always came at a price. The question now was not if he would seek a loan, but how much it would ultimately cost him. The decision, once made in the dark of night, brought no relief, only a cold, heavy certainty. A few days later, Lucius prepared for the journey to Rome. It was a journey he had made only a handful of times in his life. Always for a specific purpose, to register for the census or to sell a surplus of olive oil in a good year. This time felt different. He was not going as a proud producer, but as a beggar. He washed himself carefully with the cold well water and put on his best tunic, a coarse woolen garment that Cassia had mended so many times the seams were thick with careful stitches. It was clean but threadbare, a humble testament to his station. Cassia pressed a small bundle into his hands, a piece of hard cheese and a small dense loaf of their bean flour bread. Neither of them spoke of the true purpose of the journey, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them, thick with shame and anxiety. He left the farm before dawn, a solitary figure walking into the gray, pre-dawn light, the world of his home and family, shrinking behind him with every step. The road to Rome was a slow transformation. The familiar dusty track that wound past his farm gradually merged with wider, more beaten paths. He walked past other small farms, some looking as desperate as his own, others larger and better irrigated, that seemed to have weathered the drought with ease. Soon he was joined by other travelers, merchants with laden mules, farmers driving squealing pigs to market, official-looking men on horseback who rode past him with indifference, kicking up clouds of dust. The quiet hum of the countryside was slowly replaced by a rising cacophony, the braying of donkeys, the shouting of drivers, the rumble of heavy wooden cartwheels on the stone-paved road. The air grew thicker, smelling of smoke, animals, and the press of too many people. After hours of walking, he saw the city. It did not appear as a majestic skyline of marble, but as a sprawling, chaotic stain on the horizon, a haze of smoke and dust from which rose the rooftops of towering tenement blocks, the insulae. Lucius entered Rome not through a grand triumphal gate, but through a crowded, filthy portal where the press of bodies was overwhelming. For a man accustomed to the open sky and the slow rhythm of the fields, the city was a physical assault on the senses. The streets were narrow, dark canyons between buildings that seemed to lean in on him, blocking out the sun. The noise was a constant, deafening roar vendors hawking their wares, children screaming, dogs barking, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil. The smells were of sewage, cooking food, unwashed bodies, and the pungent odor of the tanneries. Lucius felt utterly lost, a country mouse in a world of city rats, and his resolve wavered. He had been given a name, passed in a whisper from another farmer who had faced a similar plight years ago, Gaius Valerius Messer. Not a great patrician from an ancient line, but a man of the equestrian order, a fenerator, a moneylender, whose entire fortune was built upon the misfortunes of others. Finding his house took the better part of the morning, inquiring hesitant questions posed to strangers who either ignored him or looked at him with suspicion. Finally, he found himself standing before it in a cleaner, quieter part of the city. The house was not a palace, but it was large and imposing, its walls freshly whitewashed, its heavy wooden door bound with bronze. It was a fortress of wealth, and Lucius, standing at its gate, felt his own poverty as a tangible, shameful cloak. He was not greeted, but merely allowed entry by a grim-faced slave who gestured him into a courtyard. Here he was made to wait, was not alone. A dozen other men sat or stood in the courtyard, their faces etched with the same weary desperation he felt in his own heart. There was an old man whose artisan's tunic was stained with dye, a young farmer who looked barely out of his teens, and a grim-faced shopkeeper who stared intently at the ground. They were a silent fraternity of the desperate, avoiding each other's eyes, each man alone in his private misery. Slaves and freedmen bustled through the courtyard, ignoring the supplicants completely, their air of busy self-importance, a clear message. You are nothing here. The sun climbed high in the sky, beating down into the enclosed space. Lucius's stomach churned. This, he thought, was the first price of borrowing money. The complete and utter loss of dignity. After an eternity, his name was called, was led through a dark corridor into an office, a tablinum, whose luxury was a quiet but powerful form of intimidation. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cedar wood. A detailed mosaic of a hunting scene decorated the floor. The walls were covered in frescoes of pastoral landscapes, a cruel mockery of the world Lucius had just lost. Behind a large carved wooden desk sat Gaius Valerius Messer. He was a man of about 50, his hair graying at the temples, his face unlined by physical labor. He was dressed in a fine, clean toga, and his hands, resting on the desk, were soft and pale. He radiated an aura of cold, dispassionate control. He did not rise or offer a greeting, but simply gestured for Lucius to state his business. With a dry mouth, Lucius told his story. Mir spoke of the drought, the failed harvest, the death of his ox. He tried to speak with the dignity of a free man, but the words came out sounding like the pathetic excuses of a failure. Gaius Valerius listened without a single flicker of emotion, his dark eyes fixed on Lucius, not with sympathy, but with the calculating gaze of a butcher assessing livestock. When Lucius finished, there was a long silence. "You want a loan to purchase a new ox and grain to feed your family until the next harvest?" Gaius stated, not as a question, but as a summary of a common and tedious story. "The risk is considerable. The harvest may fail again. The gods willing, it will not," Lucius murmured. Gaius gave a slight, dismissive smile. "I do not lend based on the will of the gods. I lend based on security." He named a sum, an amount that seemed both vast and barely adequate. Then he laid out the terms. The interest, the usury, would be calculated at 1/12 of the principal for each month, a rate that meant the debt would grow by half its original size in just 6 months. Lucius, who understood the world in seasons and bushels, struggled to grasp the brutal mathematics of it. "For security," Gaius continued, his voice as flat as a stone, "your farm, the land, the house, your tools will be collateral." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "And there is one final condition, standard for a loan of this nature, to a man of your standing." He leaned forward slightly. "Should you fail to repay the principal and all accumulated interest on the agreed date, 1 year from today, your pledge will be finalized through Nexem. Your body, your labor, becomes forfeit to me until such a time as the debt is worked off. You will be bound to me by law." The word Nexem landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Debt bondage. Lucius had heard tales of it, of free men forced into a state of semi-slavery, working in the fields or mines of their creditors. He looked at the lender's soft hands and thought of his own, calloused and cracked from a lifetime of free labor. The thought of those hands working for this man, under compulsion, was a horror beyond imagining. He felt a desperate urge to run, to flee the cool, quiet room, and return to his honorable poverty. But then the image of Kashia's worried face, of his children's hungry eyes, rose before him. There was no choice. He had walked into a trap, but it was a trap he had sought out himself. "I accept the terms," Lucius said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Gaius Valerius nodded once, showing no surprise or satisfaction. He clapped his hands, and a clerk entered with a wooden frame holding a wax tablet. The terms were read aloud in a dry, monotonous voice. The clerk handed Lucius a stylus. The trembling hand, Lucius, who could barely write his own name, made his mark in the soft wax. Gaius Valerius then pressed the seal of his ring into the wax beside Lucius's mark. The deal was done. The clerk counted out a pile of silver and bronze coins into a leather pouch. It felt impossibly heavy in Lucius's hand. He was dismissed, walked out of the house, back into the blinding sun and the noise of the city in a daze. The pouch of coins was a cold, heavy weight against his leg. He had what he came for. He had the means to survive. But as he began the long, dusty walk home, he knew that he had sold more than his land. He had sold his freedom, pledging it against the hope of a single successful harvest. He had traded the simple hardship he knew for a terrible, uncertain future. And the weight of that knowledge was far heavier than any pouch of coins. The year that followed was one of relentless, anxious toil. Lucius returned from Rome with the pouch of coins, a tangible symbol of his pact with Gaius Valerius. The money, which had seemed so vital in the lender's office, now felt like a curse. Every coin he spent was a reminder of the debt that hung over his family. He traveled to a nearby livestock market and, after a long day of haggling, purchased a new ox. It was a young, strong animal, but it was untrained, and Lucius spent weeks patiently teaching it to follow the yoke and pull the plow in a straight line. A frustrating task that constantly reminded him of the old, familiar partner he had lost. He also bought sacks of seed grain, paying the merchants high prices, his heart aching with every bronze as that left his hand. That spring, Lucius worked with a grim, joyless determination. He was the first in the fields before dawn, and the last to leave after dusk, his silhouette a lonely figure against the twilight sky. He pushed himself and the new ox to their limits, plowing and sowing every inch of his land. There was no room for error, no allowance for bad luck. Every action was measured against the debt. When he looked at the sky, he wasn't just observing the weather. He was searching for any sign that might jeopardize his repayment. Every cloud was a source of hope. Every dry spell, a cause for quiet panic. The simple satisfaction he had once found in his labor was gone, replaced by a constant low hum of fear. His family felt the change. Lucius was more silent, his face permanently etched with a deep furrow of worry. The easy laughter that had once filled their small home was now a rarity. Marcus worked alongside his father, feeling the new, desperate urgency in their tasks. Cassia managed the household with the same quiet efficiency, but her eyes constantly followed her husband, mirroring his anxiety. They were all soldiers in a silent war against an invisible enemy. The gods, or perhaps just fortune, seemed to smile on them. The spring rains were gentle and steady. The summer was warm and bright without being scorching. The crops grew strong and tall, the heads of wheat filling out, the grapevines hanging heavy with plump, healthy fruit. As the harvest approached, a fragile sense of hope began to bloom in Lucius's heart. It was a good year. The yield would be strong, perhaps even bountiful. He allowed himself to imagine the scene. Walking back into Gaius Valerius's office, not with just the interest, but with the entire sum, placing the pouch of coins on the desk and walking out a free man. The thought was so powerful, it almost brought him to his knees. The harvest was everything he had hoped for. The wheat was plentiful, the grapes juicy, the olives rich with oil. The storeroom was once again filled to capacity, its dusty air thick with the scent of abundance. For the first time in over a year, the family ate their fill without the guilt of rationing. A small measure of peace returned to the farmhouse. The immediate threat of starvation was gone. Once the crops were processed and stored, the true accounting began. On a cool autumn evening, with a piece of charcoal and a smooth, flat stone, Lucius and Cassia sat down to calculate their future. They set aside the grain they would need to feed the family until the next harvest. They set aside the seed for the spring sowing. They calculated the amount of oil and wine they could sell at the market. The surplus was real, the largest they had seen in years, A wave of relief washed over Lucius. It would be enough. It had to be. Then they calculated the debt. The principal loan, a formidable sum, was the starting point. To that, they had to add the interest, the crushing usurier that had been silently growing with every passing month. As Lucius scratched the final tally onto the stone, the blood drained from his face. The number was monstrous. His bountiful harvest, the fruit of a year of back-breaking, heart-wrenching labor, was not enough. He saw with sickening clarity that if he sold every spare bushel of wheat, every drop of surplus oil, he would have enough to pay the interest in full. But after that, there would be only a handful of coins left over. The principal, the great weight of the original loan, would remain almost untouched. He had worked an entire year, a perfect year, just to keep from drowning. He hadn't moved forward an inch. He had simply paid rent on his own life for another year. The realization was a colder blow than the death of his ox had been. Nature's cruelty was something a farmer could understand. But this was the cold, unfeeling cruelty of mathematics, a trap built of numbers. He explained the figures to Cassia, his voice hollow. She stared at the charcoal marks on the stone, her face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into despair. They were running as fast as they could, only to find themselves standing in the exact same place. A few weeks later, Lucius made the long journey to Rome once more. This time, his pouch was heavy with the fruits of his labor. The journey was not filled with the shame of a beggar, but with the grim resignation of a tribute-bearer. He was not going to ask for a favor, but to deliver the spoils of his own defeat. He was admitted to the house of Gaius Valerius without having to wait in the courtyard. He was a known quantity now, a debtor on the books. The meeting was brief and transactional. Lucius stood before the desk as Gaius Valerius's clerk counted the coins, stacking them in neat piles. The room was just as he remembered it, cool and quiet, a world away from the sun and soil that had produced this wealth. "Excellent," Gaius said when the counting was finished. His voice held no warmth, only the dry satisfaction of a successful calculation. "The interest is paid in full. You are a man of your word, Lucius Vibius." Lucius stood silently, his hands empty. Gaius made a small note on a wax tablet. "Of course," he continued, not looking up, "this settles the matter of the accumulated interest only. The principal remains. It will naturally begin to accrue its own interest from this day forward." He finally looked at Lucius, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. "I trust next year's harvest will be even more productive. The words were spoken softly, but they landed like a whip. Gaius Valerius was not displeased. He was delighted. Lucius was the perfect investment, a man honest enough to pay, but too poor to ever escape. He was a spring that would produce silver year after year. "I was pleased to hear you purchased a fine new ox," Gaius remarked casually, steepling his soft fingers. "And your son Marcus, is he strong, a good worker?" The question struck Lucius with a cold dread. The lender knew about his ox. He knew about his son. It was a subtle, chilling reminder that Gaius had not just secured a loan with land and a name. He had taken an inventory of every asset Lucius possessed, including the potential labor of his children. The pressure was no longer just financial. It was personal. It was a quiet threat, a reminder of the final clause in their contract. Lucius mumbled a reply and was dismissed. He walked out of the house, his coin pouch empty and limp. He had fulfilled his obligation, yet his burden was not lightened. The debt remained a living thing, ready to grow again in the darkness. As he trudged the long road home, the setting sun cast his shadow long and distorted before him. It felt like the shadow of the debt itself, stretching out to mock him. He had won the battle against the earth, only to lose the war against the numbers. He was returning to his family with nothing but the guarantee of another year of the same desperate struggle. The cycle had begun. The seasons turned again, and life on the farm fell into a grim, repetitive pattern. The work was no longer a source of pride, but a frantic race against the silent accumulation of interest. Lucius, Cassia, and young Marcus worked with a mechanical efficiency, their movements driven by a desperate need to wring every possible ounce of produce from the soil. The fragile hope that had sustained them through the first year of the loan had evaporated, replaced by the stark, cold reality of their situation. They were no longer working for themselves, for their future, or for their children's inheritance. They were working for Gaius Valerius Messer. The farm was no longer their home. It was a millstone, and they were the beasts of burden, grinding away to produce wealth for a man in the city. This year, the weather was kind once more. The fields promised another decent, if not bountiful, harvest. A fragile, exhausted sense of routine began to settle over the family. They knew the impossible task that lay ahead to pay the enormous interest while trying to chip away at the principal, but at least the task was familiar. The enemy was known. They did not realize that the battlefield was about to change. One day in late spring, two figures on horseback appeared on the road below the farm. They were not merchants or travelers. They wore the insignia of the Roman state, and one carried a rolled proclamation. They were lictors' attendants to a magistrate, and their arrival sent a ripple of unease through the quiet countryside. They stopped at the crossroads, unrolled the scroll, and in a loud, impersonal voice that carried on the still air, announced a new decree from the Senate and people of Rome. A census was to be conducted, and with it, a new tributum was levied upon all landowning citizens. The war with Carthage, which had been a distant rumor for so long, had entered a new and costly phase. More ships were needed, more legions had to be supplied, and the Republic was demanding the wealth of its citizens to pay for it. The tax was due by the end of the month, well before the harvest could be brought in. For the wealthy, this was an inconvenience. For Lucius, it was a death sentence. He had no money. Every coin from the last harvest had been poured into the insatiable maw of Gaius Valerius's interest payment. He had nothing saved, nothing hidden. The state was demanding a payment he simply could not make. For days, a heavy, despairing silence hung over the farmhouse. Lucius barely ate or slept, his mind racing through the same impossible scenarios. He could refuse to pay, but that would mean being branded a defaulter to the state, with his land seized and himself thrown into prison. He could sell the ox, but that would mean sacrificing the harvest and defaulting on his loan to Gaius Valerius, leading to debt bondage. Both paths led to ruin. The pressure was immense, a closing vice. The local magistrate's officials were efficient, and the penalty for evasion was severe. He saw his neighbors, other small farmers, beginning to sell off what they could have goed here, a cart there, their faces tight with worry. Finally, Lucius realized there was only one way to get the money in time. He had to borrow again. The thought of returning to Gaius Valerius was unbearable. To appear before him not only as a debtor, but as a man whose finances were so fragile that a single tax could shatter them, was a humiliation he could not face. He was certain he would be refused anyway. A good lender, he reasoned, does not throw good money after bad. He needed another source, a different kind of lender. He learned from another farmer of men in the city who operated outside the formal system of patrons like Gaius Valerius. They were negotiators, Bacalli financiers, often freedmen or foreigners, who asked fewer questions but demanded a much higher price. They dealt in small, short-term loans for the truly desperate, for those with no other options. So for the third time, Lucius made the journey to Rome. This trip was steeped in a deeper shame than the others. He was no longer borrowing to invest in his farm or to survive a natural disaster. He was borrowing money simply to pay a debt, a classic sign of a man in a hopeless spiral. He found the lender not in an impressive house, but in a cramped, cluttered stall in a noisy market near the river docks. The man, a freedman with shrewd, restless eyes, listened to Lucius's request with an air of boredom. He agreed to the loan almost immediately, the sum just enough to cover the tax. The terms were brutal. The interest rate was nearly double what Gaius Valerius charged, and the loan was due in full in 6 months, right after the harvest. There was no formal contract with a seal, just a witnessed verbal agreement and a mark on the lender's legura cruder, but no less binding form of entrapment. Lucius took the coins and fled the market, feeling dirtier and more compromised than ever before. He paid the tax just before the deadline, the official stamping his register with an indifferent flick of the wrist. He had satisfied the Republic, but he had shackled himself to a second, even more vicious master. As the harvest approached, a frantic, desperate energy seized him. He now owed 2 men. The combined interest payments were a sum so large that he knew, with chilling certainty, that his farm could not possibly produce enough to cover it. The mathematics had become a fantasy. The spiral had begun to tighten, and its effects were immediate and devastating. The second lender began sending aggressive messengers to the farm, demanding preliminary payments and reminding Lucius of the deadline. To appease him, Lucius was forced to start selling the very fabric of his family's life. It began with small things. Cassia took the fine woolen blankets she had woven for the winter to the local market, selling them for a handful of coins. Lucius sold a set of carving tools his father had given him. Each sale was a small surrender, a piece of their history and comfort traded for a few more days of peace. But it was not enough. The demands grew more insistent. Finally, with a heavy heart, Lucius untied 2 of their 3 goats and led them to market. The goats were Cassia's pride, providing the milk and cheese that were a vital part of their diet. His daughter Livia wept inconsolably. She had raised them from kids, and she followed her father down the road, pleading with him, until Cassia had to gently lead her back to the house. Lucius sold the goats for a fraction of their worth to a smug-faced butcher, the coins feeling like stones in his hand. He returned to a home that was colder and quieter. The loss of the animals was more than an economic blow. It was a wound to the family spirit. Their small world was being dismantled, piece by piece, to feed the unseen monsters of the city. Lucius now lived in a state of constant fear. He was no longer working towards a distant goal of freedom. He was simply trying to survive the next demand, the next threat. The faint hope of ever repaying his debts was gone, replaced by the daily, exhausting struggle of juggling his obligations to two different creditors, knowing that the failure to satisfy either one would mean his ultimate ruin. The gyre was widening, and Lucius was spinning helplessly at its center. The harvest, when it finally came, felt like a bitter mockery. It was a perfectly ordinary harvest, the kind that in years past would have signified another year of stability, another season of life wrested from the soil. But against the colossal weight of two separate debts, it was almost meaningless. The grain they threshed and the olives they pressed were no longer theirs. They were merely assets to be liquidated. Tallied on the cold ledgers of men in the city, Lucius faced an impossible choice. The second lender, the freedman from the market, was aggressive, and his threats were immediate. Gaius Valerius was the greater power, the one who held the deed to the farm and ultimately to Lucius's freedom. After days of agonizing indecision, Lucius made a desperate calculation. He sold the majority of his harvest at the local market for a poor price, as he was forced to sell quickly. With the proceeds, he paid the freedmen in full, the exorbitant interest biting deeply into the sum. He did this not out of any sense of honor, but out of pure fear. He wanted the man's menacing agents to stop appearing at his farm, to stop looking at his wife and children with their cold, appraising eyes. The payment brought a temporary end to the harassment, but it left him with an almost empty coin pouch. It was a pittance, not even a tenth of the interest he now owed to Gaius Valerius. His heart heavy with the certainty of his doom, he made his final journey as a landowner to Rome. He walked the familiar road, but he felt like a stranger. The land he passed, the trees, the very air, seemed to belong to another world, one from which he was about to be permanently exiled. He did not carry a pouch heavy with tribute, but one that was light with the pathetic remnants of his failure. At the house of Gaius Valerius, the slaves seemed to sense his changed status. He was treated with a cool, dismissive contempt. He was no longer a struggling client, but a piece of refuse to be dealt with. He was shown into the now dreaded tablinum. Gaius Valerius was inspecting a scroll and did not look up for a long time. Letting Lucius stand in the center of the room, a humble, threadbare figure on the grand mosaic floor. Finally, the lender looked up, his face devoid of any expression. "You are late," he said. It was a simple statement of fact. Lucius's voice was barely a whisper. He explained, in faltering sentences, the story of the tributum, the second loan, the impossibility of his situation. He reached into his pouch and placed the few remaining coins on the corner of the polished desk. They made a small, pathetic clicking sound in the silent room. Gaius Valerius did not even glance at the money. He listened to the entire story with an unnerving stillness. When Lucius fell silent, the lender leaned back in his chair. There was no anger, no negotiation, no discussion. The time for that was long past. "The terms of the contract were precise," Gaius said, his voice as calm and final as a judge pronouncing a sentence. "The agreement was for 1 year. I have been patient for 2. You have defaulted on your payment. The collateral is now forfeit." He paused. "The farm, Lucius Vibius, and everything on it is now legally mine. My agents will arrive in 5 days' time to take possession. You and your family will be expected to have vacated the premises by then." And that was it. A life's work, a family's heritage, erased in a few cold sentences. There was no appeal. Lucius had signed the tablet, made his mark, and pledged his world against a promise he could not keep. The contract had been honored. He felt a strange numbness, a sense of unreality. He had dreaded this moment for so long that its arrival felt almost like a relief, the kind of relief a condemned man feels when the axe finally falls. He did not remember the walk back to the farm. He moved like a man in a dream, his feet carrying him over the dusty road, while his mind remained in that cold, quiet room. He arrived home in the late afternoon. Cassia saw the look on his face and knew, before he had even spoken a word. He told her in the fading light of their last few days, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. They were to leave. The farm was no longer theirs. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply stated the facts, the final brutal arithmetic of their failure. Cassia sat on a low stool, her hands clasped in her lap, and tears streamed silently down her face. She did not weep for the hardship to come, but for the life they were losing, for the memories embedded in the very stones of the house and the soil of the fields. The children, seeing their mother's silent grief, grew quiet and afraid, sensing that their world had irrevocably broken. The last days were a funereal haze. They began to pack, but there was so little to take. Their lives had been stripped down to the barest of essentials. A few clay pots, some woolen blankets, the children's single wooden toys, the tools of Lucius's trade that he was allowed to keep. Every object was a painful memory. Packing the cooking pot, Cassia remembered the thousands of simple family meals she had prepared in it. Packing his father's old whetstone, Lucius remembered the feeling of his father's hand guiding his as a boy. They were not just packing objects, they were packing the ghosts of a life that was already gone. Lucius spent his last day walking the boundaries of his land. It was a farewell. Crumbled the dark, familiar soil in his hands one last time. He laid a hand on the wrinkled bark of the ancient olive trees, the ones his grandfather had planted. He stood on the hill overlooking the fields and watched the sun set on his home for the final time. This was more than the loss of a livelihood. It was the loss of identity. He was not Lucius Vibius Caecina, the farmer. He was now just Lucius, a landless, destitute man, a failure. On the morning of the 5th day, they left. They did not wait for the lender-s agents to arrive and throw them off their own land. Lucius would not give them the satisfaction. Loaded their meager possessions onto a small, rickety handcart he had built years ago. Cassia took one last look at her home, her face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged her overnight. Lucius closed the wooden door, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. He pushed the cart, and the family fell in behind him. Marcus, his face set in a grim imitation of his father's, tried to help push. Livia held tightly to her mother's hand, looking back at the house until it was just a small, white speck that finally disappeared from view. They walked away from the land of their ancestors, away from the graves of their kin, away from everything they had ever known. They joined the dusty road, just another anonymous, dispossessed family. Their destination was the only place left for people like them, the great hungry city that had devoured their future. They were heading to Rome. The arrival in Rome was not an arrival at all. It was an absorption. The city did not welcome them. It swallowed them whole. Lucius, Cassia, and the children, dusty and bone-weary from their long walk, were just one more ragged family flowing into the insatiable heart of the Republic. The cart, with its pathetic collection of their former lives, felt like an anchor, dragging them down as they tried to navigate the churning currents of the streets. The noise, the sheer, relentless press of humanity was a physical force, pushing and pulling at them. For people who had lived their lives by the quiet rhythm of the sun and seasons, the city was a chaotic, screaming nightmare. They had nowhere to go. Lucius had a cousin on his mother's side, a man he hadn't seen in 20 years, who was said to live and work somewhere within the city walls. This vague, half-forgotten connection was their only hope. They spent their first day in a desperate, bewildering search. Lucius would leave Cassia and the children in the relative safety of a temple courtyard, guarding their cart while he plunged into the labyrinthine streets to ask for directions. But Rome was a world of a million faces, a place of constant motion. No one had heard of his cousin. The city was a monument to anonymity, and they were utterly insignificant within it. As dusk began to fall, a cold panic set in. They could not spend the night on the streets. They needed shelter. With their meager handful of remaining coins, they were forced to seek lodging in the only district that would have them, the Subira. This was the notorious belly of Rome, a sprawling, densely packed neighborhood teeming with the city's poorest souls. As they pushed their cart into its narrow, winding streets, the world changed. The sky vanished, blotted out by towering, dilapidated tenement blocks, the infamous insulae, which leaned against each other for support like ancient, weary drunkards. Some were 6, 7, even 8 stories high, their rickety wooden balconies and endless laundry lines creating a dense canopy that plunged the streets below into a perpetual twilight. The noise here was different, more intimate, and more menacing. It was the sound of 1,000 lives crammed together in desperation, the shouting of families from open windows, the wailing of infants, the drunken singing from a grimy tavern, the sharp clang of a metalworker's hammer from a ground-floor workshop. And the smell was overwhelming, a foul miasma of human waste, rotting garbage tossed from the windows above, and the cheap, greasy food cooked over smoky braziers. It was the stench of poverty, and it clung to the back of the throat. Their search for a room was a demeaning ordeal. Landlords, or rather, the brutal agents who managed the properties, looked them over with undisguised contempt. They were shown spaces that were barely habitable, windowless cellars that smelled of damp and mold, tiny rooms that already housed other families, spaces with collapsed floors or leaking ceilings. The rent for each was shockingly high, a testament to the desperate demand for any kind of shelter. With each refusal, the small pouch of coins Lucius carried grew lighter, and his heart grew heavier. Finally, near nightfall, they found a place. An agent, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, led them to an insula that seemed even more precarious than the others. The wooden staircase inside was steep, narrow, and treacherous, sagging and creaking with every step. They climbed and climbed past doorways from which came sounds of arguments and weeping, past landings that were dark and foul-smelling. They ascended towards the sky until, on the 7th and final landing, the agent shoved open a flimsy wooden door. This was the cenaculum, an attic room, the cheapest lodging in the entire building. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the 4 of them to lie down. The ceiling sloped sharply, forcing even the children to stoop on one side. The walls were thin planks, covered in peeling plaster, cracks through which they could hear the movements and voices of their unseen neighbors with unnerving clarity. There was a single, small, unglazed window, little more than a square hole in the wall. It offered no view, only a terrifyingly close perspective of the neighboring tenement's grimy wall. It let in the ceaseless noise and the foul air of the Subura, but very little light. The floorboards were uneven and drafty, Agent pointed out the leaking roof tiles with a shrug. It keeps out most of the rain, he said, before demanding the first month's rent in advance. The payment took almost everything Lucius had left. This was their new home. A cramped, flimsy box suspended high above the filth of the city, exposed to the elements and in constant danger. Lucius knew of the infamous risks of the insulae. They were tinder boxes, entire blocks often consumed by fire in a matter of hours. They were poorly constructed, and collapses were common, burying dozens of families in their sleep. Their new life came with a constant underlying threat of a sudden violent death. He remembered the poverty of the bad years on the farm. The hunger, the worry, the hardship. But that poverty had been clean. It had been surrounded by open air, by the quiet dignity of the land. They had space, they had privacy, and they had a measure of control over their lives. This was a new kind of poverty, a degrading, claustrophobic misery. Here, they were trapped like rats in a cage, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of other people's suffering. Their every moment was public, their every whisper overheard. That first night they did not even bother to unpack the few things on the cart. They simply unrolled their blankets on the dusty floorboards and huddled together for warmth and comfort. The thin walls offered no protection from the ceaseless din of the Subura, which seemed to grow even louder after dark. A drunken brawl erupted in the street below. A baby cried inconsolably in the room next door. From the floor above came the sound of rhythmic pounding from some unknown nocturnal workshop. Sleep was impossible. Lucius lay awake, staring into the oppressive darkness, his family pressed close against him. He could feel the slight tremor of the building whenever a heavy cart rumbled past in the street far below. He thought of his farm, of the deep, profound silence of the countryside at night, broken only by the chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves in the wind. He remembered standing on his land, looking up at a vast open sky filled with stars. Now when he looked through the small square hole that was his only window, he saw nothing but a sliver of darkness between his wall and the next. He had fallen from the world of the gods in the soil into a suffocating underworld of man's own making. He was anonymous, landless, and penniless, a ghost haunted by the memory of a life he had utterly failed to protect. The first morning in the Subura was a brutal awakening. Lucius rose from the hard floorboards not to the familiar, gentle light of dawn over his own fields, but to a dim, gray twilight filtering through the grimy window. The city was already awake, its monstrous voice a constant churning roar that vibrated through the very structure of the building. For a moment, a disoriented panic seized him. He instinctively thought of the animals that needed tending, the fields that needed checking. Then, the crushing reality of his situation returned. He had no fields. He had no animals. He had no purpose. All he had was a family to feed and a landlord who would demand the next month's rent with merciless punctuality. Survival was now a daily question, and the only answer was to find work. He left the tiny room as Cassia and the children were waking, descending the treacherous stairs and plunging into the chaotic river of the streets. He asked for directions to the Forum, the great heart of Rome. He imagined it as a place of opportunity, a place where a strong, willing man could sell his labor. What he found was another kind of market, one far more demeaning than any he had ever known. In a designated corner of the vast open square, surrounded by the splendor of temples and state buildings, stood a crowd of men. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all with the same look in their eyes, a mixture of hope and desperation. They were the mercenary, the day laborers. Dispossessed farmers like himself, urban poor, migrants from distant provinces were gathered here, selling the only thing they had left, their physical strength. Lucius joined the crowd, feeling his last shred of dignity dissolve. As a landowner, he had been his own master. His hands, though calloused, had worked for himself, for his own family. Now, he was just another body in a sea of desperate men, a piece of human livestock waiting to be inspected and chosen. When a potential employer or foreman from a construction project or the agent of a wealthy merchant approached the crowd, a wave of activity would ripple through the men. It would surge forward, shouting, pushing, each man trying to catch the foreman's eye. They would flex their arms, puff out their chests, proclaiming their strength and willingness to work for the lowest possible wage. The employers were casual and cruel in their selection, grabbing a man by the arm, inspecting his teeth as if he were a horse before moving on. The shame was a fire in Lucius's gut. He, who had commanded his own small world, was now forced to beg for the chance to perform the most grueling tasks. He hung back at first, unable to bring himself to join the pathetic display. But the thought of his children's hungry faces was a sharper spur than any foreman-ass whip. He pushed his way into the throng, his voice joining the desperate chorus, his pride trampled into the dust of the forum. After hours of waiting, as the morning sun began to climb, he was chosen. A foreman for a shipping company, a man with a face like cured leather, pointed a thick finger at him and two other men. You, and you. The docks. Unloading a grain ship. From dawn till dusk. 5 asses. It was a pittance, barely enough to buy a day's worth of cheap food. But it was work. Lucius nodded dumbly and followed. The labor was brutal, mind-numbing, and utterly exhausting. The ship was moored on the Tiber, its hold filled with heavy sacks of Egyptian grain. All day long, Lucius and the other men hauled the sacks from the ship's belly, up a narrow, swaying gangplank, and into a vast, dark warehouse. The coarse burlap sacks chafed his neck and shoulders raw. The dust from the grain filled his nostrils and lungs, making him cough and wheeze. His muscles, accustomed to the varied rhythm of farm work, screamed in protest at the repetitive, relentless strain. The foreman stalked the docks, shouting insults and threats, allowing them only a brief pause to drink some brackish water from a communal bucket. Lucius worked in a daze, his mind shut down, his body moving on pure instinct, driven by the simple, desperate need to make it to the end of the day. While Lucius toiled at the docks, Cassia faced her own struggle for survival in their attic room. She could not afford to be idle. With a small portion of their remaining money, she bought a bundle of raw, greasy wool from a market vendor. Her new occupation was to be a spinner. All day, in the cramped, poorly lit room, she sat on the floor, cleaning and carding the wool before spinning it into thread with a simple drop spindle. It was painstaking, tedious work. For a full day of labor, from sunrise to sunset, she could produce a few spindles of thread, which she could then sell back to the vendor for a meager handful of coins. It was barely enough to buy a small measure of flour. Marcus, now a boy of the city, also had to contribute. He spent his day running errands, a messenger boy for anyone who would hire him, dodging carts and crowds for the chance to earn a single, precious as. The foreman blew a loud whistle. The workday was over. Lucius, his body a single, throbbing ache, lined up with the other laborers. The foreman slapped 5 bronze coins into his sweaty palm and told him to be back the next morning, if he wanted more of the same. Lucius clutched the coins in his hand. They felt pitifully light, an insulting payment for the sheer physical agony of the day. He trudged back through the darkening streets of the Subira, a ghost moving through a city of ghosts. He climbed the 7 flights of stairs, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He opened the door to their small room to find Cassia still spinning by the faint light of a tiny, smoky oil lamp. Marcus was huddled in a corner, already asleep. They pooled their day's earnings on the floor Lucius's 5 asses, Cassia's 2, and the single coin Marcus had earned. It was enough. They had survived one day. Cassia took some of the money and went down to a street vendor, returning with a piece of coarse, dark bread, a few wizened onions, and a small cup of watered-down sour wine. That was their evening meal. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation. This was not the satisfying weariness of a harvest, the shared tiredness of a family working its own land. This was the bone-deep exhaustion of the exploited, the weariness of the trapped. As Lucius chewed the gritty bread, he knew that this was his new life. There was no future, no season to look forward to. There was only the endless grinding cycle of the day, the desperate search for work at dawn, the brutal labor until dusk, and the grim accounting of coins in their squalid room at night. And tomorrow, it would all begin again. Months bled into one another, each day a near-perfect replica of the last. The family's existence became a grueling, monotonous rhythm of survival. At dawn, Lucius would descend into the streets to join the scrum of the mercenary. Cassia would begin the tedious task of spinning, her fingers constantly in motion. Marcus would scour the nearby markets for any chance to earn a single coin. At dusk, they would reconvene in their tiny attic room, pool their meager earnings, and share a meal of bread and onions before collapsing into an exhausted sleep, only to rise and repeat the cycle. The city, once a terrifying and chaotic monster, had become their new, brutal reality. The constant noise, the filth, the oppressive lack of space, they had become the mundane features of their world. They were slowly being worn down by the sheer friction of urban poverty. The children grew thinner, their faces pale from the lack of sunlight. Cassia developed a persistent cough from the dusty wool fibers and the damp air of their room. Lucius's body, once strong and hardy from the varied work of the farm, was becoming stooped and scarred, his hands permanently grimed with the filth of the docks. Their spirits were eroding just as surely as their bodies. The memory of their old life on the farm began to feel like a distant, impossible dream, a story they might tell themselves in the dark, but one that had no connection to their waking lives. Hope had been scoured away, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of endurance. Slowly, Lucius began to learn the city's harsh ecosystem. He discovered which foreman paid a coin or two more for the most dangerous work, which markets offered the cheapest, albeit stale bread, and how to navigate the crowds with a practiced efficiency. He became a familiar face at the docks, his reliability earning him a grudging preference from some of the foremen. He was chosen for work more often than not. For a brief period, a fragile sense of stability emerged. On good weeks, when all 4 of them found consistent work, they might end the day with a few extra coins after buying their food. Cassia began to save these tiny surpluses, hiding them in a crack in the wall. It was a pitifully small hoard, but it was theirs. It was the first time in years they had felt even the slightest illusion of getting ahead, a tiny buffer against absolute disaster. It was this faint glimmer of light that made the arrival of darkness so complete. One afternoon, as Lucius was wearily climbing the final flight of stairs to his room, he found two men blocking the narrow landing. They were not tenants. They were large, muscular men with the hard, impassive faces of professional thugs. They wore leather vests over their tunics, and their presence filled the cramped, dark space with a palpable menace. Lucius knew, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that they were not there by chance. "Lucius Vibius Caccina?" one of the men asked, though his tone made it clear it was not a question. Lucius nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "We have a message from your patron, Gaius." "Valerius Messer," the man said, his voice a low growl. The word patron was a deliberate, cruel irony. "He is a patient man, but his patience has its limits. Your debt remains." Lucius was stunned into silence. The debt! He had assumed in his naivety that the loss of the farm had settled the matter, that the collateral had been the final price. The second man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Did you think the land was enough? Barely covered the interest you owed him. Still owe the principal. A wise man does not simply forget a loan of that size." The truth crashed down on Lucius with the force of a physical blow. The farm hadn't cleared the debt. It was just the first payment. The shortfall, the original loan, plus all the new interest that had accrued, was still his responsibility. The debt was not tied to the land. It was tied to his name, his very person. It had followed him into the heart of the city. The first man took a step forward, crowding Lucius against the flimsy wall. "We are not here to collect coins," he said, his voice dropping lower. "We know you have nothing. We are here to deliver a final notice." His hand shot out and grabbed the front of Lucius's tunic, twisting it tightly. "There's nowhere to run, farmer. The law has a long reach in Rome." He shoved Lucius hard against the wall, the impact rattling the wooden planks. The door to their room opened, and Cassia stood there, her face white with terror. The men glanced at her, then back at Lucius, a predatory gleam in their eyes. The confrontation was public, a deliberate act of humiliation for the other tenants, peering from their doorways to witness. From inside his vest, the first man produced a small hinged set of wooden tablets, tied with a cord. He pushed it into Lucius's chest. "This is a summons, an in-use vocatio. You are called to appear before the praetor in the forum in 3 days. Gaius Valerius is making a formal claim against you." The summons was not a request. Under Roman law, to refuse it was a crime in itself. It was the first step in the legal process that would strip him of his final possession. "Be there," the man growled, releasing his grip. The two agents turned and descended the stairs, their heavy footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Lucius was left standing on the landing, the wooden tablets clutched in his trembling hand. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, their whispers already starting. He was no longer just a poor laborer. He was a marked man, a debtor, who had drawn the attention of a powerful enemy. He stumbled into his room, where Cassia and the children stared at him, their faces full of fear and questions. He sank to the floor, the last of his strength leaving him. He looked at the summons, the formal scratches on the wax representing the legal machinery that was now grinding towards him. In the countryside, he had been a man of some small standing, with a name and a history. He had neighbors who knew him, a community that, however poor, had its own unwritten rules. Here in the vast anonymous expanse of the Subura, he was nothing. He had no patrons to speak for him, no powerful friends to intercede, no money to hire an advocate. The law, which was supposed to protect all Roman citizens, was simply a tool for the wealthy, a weapon to be used against the poor. The city, which he had thought might offer a place to disappear, had become the perfect cage. He finally explained to Cassia, his voice cracking, that the debt had not died with the farm. It had followed them, a relentless predator, and now it had come to claim him. They sat in silence in their tiny, squalid room, the summons lying on the floor between them like a venomous snake. The daily, exhausting struggle for bread and shelter suddenly seemed like a minor problem. A far more terrible countdown had begun, and at its end lay a fate worse than poverty. The final chain was being forged, and Lucius had no way to stop it. The 3 days before the court appearance passed in a fog of dread. For Lucius and his family, the world shrank to the size of their tiny attic room. The constant struggle for their daily bread, which had consumed their every waking moment, now seemed insignificant. A secondary concern to the legal abyss that was about to open beneath them. Lucius did not go to the docks to seek work. There was no point. His fate was no longer in his own hands. It was to be decided in the forum by men who operated according to a set of rules he did not understand. He sat for hours on the floor, staring at the summons. While Cassia tried to maintain a fragile sense of normalcy for the children, her every movement shadowed by a quiet, desperate fear. The third day Lucius rose before dawn. He washed his face and hands in the small basin of water and put on the same worn tunic he had worn on his first journey to Gaius Valerius's house. It was the only garment he owned that was not stained with the filth of the docks. He looked like what he was, a poor, defeated man preparing to meet his executioner. Cassia pressed a small piece of bread into his hand, which he could not eat. They exchanged no words of hope or encouragement. There were none left to give. Their eyes met in a silent farewell, an acknowledgment that the man who left the room that morning might not, in any meaningful sense, be the same man who returned. He walked to the forum alone. The morning crowds were already thick, but today Lucius felt a chilling detachment from the city's chaotic energy. He was a ghost, invisible to the senators in their fine togas, the merchants haggling over prices, and the priests making their morning sacrifices. He found the praetor's court, an open-air tribunal set up on a raised platform near the Basilica Porta. It was a simple affair, a curl chair for the magistrate, benches for clerks and officials, and a space for the plaintiffs and defendants to stand. Gaius Valerius Messer was already there, accompanied by his clerk. He was dressed in a crisp, clean toga, the very picture of civic respectability. He gave Lucius a brief, indifferent nod, the kind a man might give to a piece of property he was about to formally acquire. Lucius's heart pounded in his chest. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to run, and disappear into the labyrinth of the city. But the lictors, the magistrates' attendants, stood nearby with their bundles of rods and axes, a clear symbol of the state's authority. There was no escape. When their case was called, Gaius Valerius stepped forward and presented his claim with cold, articulate precision. His clerk produced the original loan contract, the sealed wax tablet that Lucius had marked in a different lifetime. He detailed the principal, the accumulated interest, and the value he had assigned to the foreclosed farm, demonstrating the significant shortfall that remained. He spoke of his own patience, of the multiple opportunities he had given the debtor to make good on his promise. It was a masterful performance, portraying himself as a reasonable, even generous, creditor who had been forced by an unreliable client to seek the law's protection. Then it was Lucius's turn to speak. The praetor, a stern-faced aristocrat, turned his bored gaze upon him. "What say you, Lucius Vibius?" he asked. Lucius looked at the powerful magistrate, at the confident and wealthy man who was his accuser, and at the impassive faces of the clerks. He opened his mouth. But what could he say? Could he speak of the drought, the dead ox, the crushing tax, the impossible interest rates? These were the reasons for his ruin, the story of his life, but in the cold. Formal language of the law, they were merely excuses. The only legally relevant facts were the contract and the default. He had made a promise in front of witnesses and had sealed it with his mark. He had not kept it. "I cannot pay," Lucius stammered, his voice barely audible. It was the only truth that mattered here. The pretor showed no surprise. He had heard the same story 1,000 times. He glanced at the documents, conferred briefly with a clerk, and then rendered his judgment. It was swift and absolute. The debt was valid, and the debtor had confessed his inability to pay. Therefore, the creditor was entitled to his security as stipulated in the original bond. "The claim is upheld," the pretor announced, his voice ringing with finality. "By the ancient laws of this city, the debtor is now formally bound to the creditor. He is Nexus. Let the scales be brought." Lucius felt his knees grow weak. Nexus bound. The word echoed in the open air of the forum. 2 attendants brought forward a small, symbolic bronze scale. This was part of the ancient ritual of Nexum, a formal act of transfer. Gaius Valerius produced a single bronze coin, a symbolic payment, and placed it on one side of the scale. The clerk then took Lucius by the arm and guided him to stand on the other side of the scale, a symbolic weighing of a man's life against a debt. Lucius stood there, humiliated before the watching crowd. As the magistrate recited the formal legal pronouncement, declaring him adjudged and awarded to his creditor. The ceremony was over in minutes. The law had been satisfied. Lucius was no longer a free citizen in the full sense of the word. He had not been made a slave. Slavery was a different legal category, usually reserved for foreigners and prisoners of war. He was a Nexus, a Roman citizen who had forfeited his liberty, and whose labor was now the property of another man. He could not be killed without cause, but he could be worked, chained, and disciplined as his creditors saw fit. He was, for all practical purposes, a bondsman. Gaius Valerius did not speak to him. He simply gave a curt nod to one of his agents, a man Lucius recognized from the confrontation at the Insula. The agent stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Lucius's shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership. "Come," the agent said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Lucius took one last look around the forum. The heart of the republic he had once believed was his. He saw the temples, the senators, the bustling crowds, a world of freedom and power that he was now irrevocably cut off from. He had walked into the forum that morning as a poor man. He was leaving it as a possession. Lucius was not led through the main streets of Rome in chains. His bondage was a legal and economic reality, not yet a physical one. The agent of Gaius Valerius simply walked beside him, a silent, menacing guard, guiding him away from the grandeur of the forum and back into the sprawling, anonymous neighborhoods of the city. They did not return to the Subura. Instead, they walked to a different part of Rome, a district filled with warehouses, workshops, and the high-walled compounds of wealthy businessmen. They stopped before a large gated enclosure. Inside was a bustling commercial bakery, one of several businesses owned by Gaius Valerius. The air was thick with the dust of milled flour and the oppressive heat of massive stone ovens. This was to be Lucius's new world. He was brought before the overseer, a harsh-faced freedman who looked at Lucius not as a man, but as a new piece of equipment. The overseer listened to the agent's instructions, then gave Lucius a cursory inspection. He looked strong enough. The overseer grunted. "We'll see how long he lasts. Put him on the mills." With that, Lucius's life as a bondsman began. His task was the most grueling and soul-destroying work the bakery had to offer. Turning the great stone mills, the Malay Azenaria. These were massive hourglass-shaped stones, so heavy that they were usually turned by donkeys or mules. In establishments like this, however, human labor was often cheaper than animal fodder. Lucius was harnessed to a large wooden beam, yoked like an animal, alongside another man whose face was a mask of dull, vacant exhaustion. His entire day was spent in a small circular path pushing the heavy beam. It was a cycle of endless, repetitive motion. The friction of the stone grinding against stone was a deafening, monotonous roar that filled the hot, dusty air. There was no thought, no skill, no pride in the work. It was pure brute force. His world shrank to the feel of the splintered wood against his shoulder, the burning in his legs and back, and the sight of the stone floor slowly revolving beneath his feet. He was, quite literally, a human beast of burden. Life was reduced to its most basic, grim elements. He slept in a squalid, windowless barracks with the other bonded laborers and slaves who worked for Gaius Valerius. The room was overcrowded and smelled of sweat and despair. They were given 2 meals a day, a coarse, gritty porridge and a piece of hard, stale bread. Just enough sustenance to fuel another day of labor. There was no freedom, no privacy, and no rest. The days were long, beginning before sunrise and ending long after dark. And the work was relentless, broken only by the overseer's signal for their brief, silent meals. This existence was a new kind of hell, different from any hardship he had known before. On the farm, the work had been hard, but it had been his own. The rhythm of his labor had been dictated by the seasons, by the needs of the land. It had meaning and purpose. As a day laborer in the city, he had endured exploitation and humiliation. But at the end of the day, his time and his body were his own. He could return to his family, however wretched their home. Here he owned nothing. Not his time, not his labor, and not his body. He was the property of Gaius Valerius. The overseer could work him as hard as he pleased, and the only check on his cruelty was Lucius's value as an asset. A dead bondsman could not turn a mill. Lucius saw this cold logic in action. When a man collapsed from exhaustion, he was doused with water and kicked until he rose. If he could not rise, he was dragged away, his fate unknown. The other men in the barracks were ghosts. They were men like him, citizens who had fallen into the trap of debt, now working alongside slaves who had been captured in foreign wars. There was no camaraderie among them, only a shared, silent misery. They rarely spoke, as if the energy required for conversation was too much to spare. They were all consumed by their own private tragedies, their spirits as worn down as their bodies. Lucius was allowed to see his family once a week. On the designated evening, after his work was done, he was permitted to walk back to the Sabora, often under the watchful eye of a guard. These visits were moments of profound agony. He would climb the 7 flights of stairs to their attic room, his body aching, his clothes covered in the white dust of the mill. He would see Cassia, who seemed to grow thinner and more tired with each passing week, and his children. who looked at him with a mixture of love and a fearful confusion they could not articulate. He could offer them nothing. He had no coins to give, no comfort to share. He was a symbol of their ruin, a father who could no longer protect or provide. He would sit with them for a short time in their tiny room, the silence between them heavy with all the things they could not say. He would listen to Cassia's report of the week, the struggle to find work, the rising cost of grain, Marcus's latest attempt to earn a coin. He would try to hold on to this brief connection to the world of family and love, but it felt like trying to cup water in his hands. The moment he left, it would be gone. His status as a nexus had a cruel ambiguity. He was not a slave. He was still technically a Roman citizen. This meant his children were not born into slavery. It meant he could not be sold to a foreigner. But these were abstract legal distinctions that meant nothing in the face of his daily reality. His reality was the harness, the grinding stone, and the overseer's lash. He had the name of a citizen, but the life of a beast. This legal fiction was perhaps the cruelest part of his punishment. A constant reminder that he was a man who had freely signed away his own freedom. A Roman who had failed so completely that he now lived a life indistinguishable from the lowest slave. Lucius's story, as grim as it was not unique. Throughout the centuries of the Roman Republic, his fate was shared by tens of thousands of his fellow plebeians. The small farmers who were the backbone of the Roman army and the heart of the Roman people were constantly locked in this same desperate struggle. They would leave their farms to fight in the Republic's endless wars, only to return home to find their fields neglected and their families burdened by debt, often owed to the very aristocrats who had led them into battle. This widespread suffering was not just a collection of private tragedies. It was a festering wound in the body of the Republic itself. It was this very issue of debt bondage that fueled one of the greatest social and political struggles in Roman history. The conflict of the orders. The plebeian class, pushed to the brink, realized their ultimate power. They were the soldiers. They were the workers. Without them, Rome could not function. On several historic occasions, they enacted a radical and powerful protest known as the Secessio Plebis, the secession of the plebs. They would abandon the city en masse, marching to a nearby hill and refusing to work, to fight, or to obey the magistrates until their grievances were addressed. It was a general strike that paralyzed the state and forced the ruling patrician class to the negotiating table. Out of these conflicts came monumental changes. The plebeians won the right to elect their own tribunes, officials who could protect them and veto the actions of the Senate. And, most importantly for men like Lucius, they won a victory over debt. In the year 326 BCE, nearly 75 years before Lucius walked into Gaius Valerius's office, a law was passed that struck at the heart of the system. The Lex Poetilia Papiria abolished the practice of nexum, the formal bonding of a citizen for a loan. The law decreed that a man's property could be seized for a debt, but his body, his person, could not. A Roman citizen could no longer be shackled or enslaved for what he owed. It was a landmark victory, a testament to the power of the common people. But the law, as is so often the case, was only a partial shield. While the old formal ritual of nexum was outlawed, the wealthy and powerful always found new ways to secure their investments. Men like Gaius Valerius operated in the gray areas of the law. A debtor could still be brought to court, and if he could not pay, he could be imprisoned indefinitely, not as a bondsman, but as a convicted defaulter. Faced with the horror of life in a Roman prison, most men would choose to enter into a voluntary labor contract with their creditor, a private agreement that was in all but name, the same as the bondage of old. The chains were no longer forged by a formal state ritual, but by the threat of starvation and the terror of the law courts. And so, for Lucius, there would be no dramatic rescue, no freeing of the bondsman by a righteous tribune. The Lex Poetelia Papiria was a story from his grandfather's time, victory whose protections had been eroded by clever new legal traps. His fate was sealed, not by an ancient brutal law, but by a modern efficient one. Years passed. Lucius's strong farmer's body was slowly ground down by the relentless, repetitive labor at the mill. His hair grew gray, and his face settled into the permanent, weary mask of the hopeless. He grew old in the service of Gaius Valerius. He was eventually moved from the back-breaking work at the mill to less strenuous, but equally monotonous, tasks around the compound mending sacks. Cleaning the stables, guarding the gates at night. He became a fixture, a silent, shuffling ghost, his story and his name forgotten by all but himself. His debt was never repaid, was never meant to be. The labor he performed was valued at only a few coins a day by his master, while the principal of the loan continued to exist on a ledger, a legal fiction that guaranteed his servitude for life. On his weekly visits, he watched his children grow up from a distance. He saw Marcus grow from a boy into a lean, tough young man of the city, working the same brutal, uncertain jobs as a day laborer that Lucius had once worked. He saw Livia grow into a woman, her face already lined with the same worry that had marked her mother. There was a bitter, painful solace in their lives. They were free. Marcus might be poor, exploited, and hungry, but no creditor could legally put him in a harness. The victory of his ancestors had not saved Lucius, but it had saved his son. It was the only legacy he had left. His family story would continue, a grim struggle for survival in the merciless heart of Rome, but it would continue without the formal chains he now bore. His failure was the final, terrible price paid for their freedom. Conclusion: Lucius's long struggle is over now. His story, like so many others, fades back into the quiet dust of history. The great machine of Rome would continue to turn, built on the strength and suffering of millions of forgotten lives. His was the quiet battle, fought not with a sword, but against the crushing weight of a promise he could not keep. His long day is over, and now so is yours. There is nothing left to do but to rest, to let go of the day, and to drift into the deep and peaceful sleep that you deserve. Lucius's long struggle is over now. Story, like so many others, fades back into the quiet dust of history. The great machine of Rome would continue to turn, built on the strength and suffering of millions of forgotten lives. His was the quiet battle, fought not with a sword, but against the crushing weight of a promise he could not keep. His long day is over, and now so is yours. There is nothing left to do but to rest, to let go of the day, and to drift into the deep and peaceful sleep that you deserve.